Hello, beautiful people. I am Oliver Perrin for Semiagog, joined today by Matt, Twitter mutual with a shared interest in the great game in general and the area of the South Caucasus and Caucasus in particular. And we hope to have another guest in a bit who is delayed, but will be joining us in the midst of the stream. Hopefully before too long. Please, everyone, let me know whether or not there are any issues with the audio. Hopefully it's coming through loud and clear. Please do consider buying my book. You can see links actually for two of my books, one a sci-fi book and another one, a collection of poetry, down below in the video description. You can also find a link for my guest, Matt. It's a link to his Substack. I hope that everyone will go and check out the article there, which Matt selected because it's relevant to the topic that we're going to be considering today, which is all the goings on in Transcaucasia, or the South Caucasus, and doubtless a bit the situation in the Caucasus more generally, and then specifically as regards the hopes and aspirations, or the cunning ploys of NATO and the United States and the European Union. And then balanced against that, the interests of Russia, which has long been hegemon, exercising influence in this area. There's Iran, which is a very significant part of this picture as well. And we cannot leave out Turkey, nor can we leave out China with its Belt and Road projects. So this is an area where all sorts of things come together. It's an area of great strategic importance, not least for energy, logistics in general, trade, as well as military, and security issues, most specifically for Russia as a large player in the area, certainly for Iran. It's central to a number of Turkey's interests and aspirations as well, in terms of linking up with what it sees as the larger Turkic language-speaking world in the stands and in Central Asia. But it's also of critical importance for the 2 or 3 central countries that we're going to be considering, that are, of course, dead in the middle of this region: Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. Typically, the area, or once upon a time, back when people knew things and spoke English, the area to the north, along the ridge of the Caucasus, was called Ciscaucasia, and below Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia, arguably some of the most northeastern parts of Turkey, could be called Transcaucasia. Today, they're generally called the South Caucasus. And let's pull up a map here. I'm going to go over some stuff and just give a general picture. Then I'm going to bring Matt in, allow him to introduce himself, and get into anything that I may have missed. He's a keen observer of events in this region, follows the news closely. Let me add this image. So you can see here, hopefully my cursor's showing up. This is the Caucasus. Here we have the Caspian. Here we have the Black Sea. Here's where all the current unpleasantness is underway in Ukraine. We've got Turkey, Iran, of course. Let me get in a bit closer on this so we can see what's going on here. One of the most important things to recognize about this region is that it is very rough country, and north-south actions in terms of transport and logistics, there are a limited number of ways that you can run north to south through here. One of the historic ways was the Georgian military highway, which is generally in this region here. It was created by Yermolov, one of the Russian generals, if I remember correctly, in the 19th century during the Russo-Caucasian Wars, the wars that they were having with the Circassians in the northwestern Caucasus, and with Sheikh Shamil in the eastern Caucasus, Dagestan. And north-south travel here is difficult, which makes this Caucasian chain of mountains here sort of like the southern fortress wall of Russia, because once you get past it, it opens up into steppe area, more or less. So north-south travel here is exceedingly difficult. East-west looks like it could be a bit easier, but if you were to pull up a map of the kind of roads and the development of major highways, you can see there's not much here. So it will be possible at some point, certainly if NATO, or certainly if the European Union and China have their way, and to a certain extent Turkey as well, east-west transport through this area will be easier than north-south at some point. But at present, there's potential there, but it is not. It's not going to be something that can be immediately achieved. Okay, so another thing to understand is that in 2008, we had the beginning of all the trouble between the East and the West in terms of NATO and Russia. There's an area roughly in here called South Ossetia. The Ossetis are an Iranic language-speaking group in Indo-European language families. And they're right in this area. There's North Ossetia as well. This former Russian military highway, it's shifted its route slightly. The original route is there, and then there's sort of a branch that runs that's can take more traffic these days, that is better developed. And it just so happens that that very highway, which is of enormous strategic significance, certainly to Russia and to anyone who would wish to invade Russia, just happens to fall smack dab in the midst of South Ossetia. So you can believe the claims that are made about, Georgia wanting to, rein in this breakaway region. But the reality is that all of this argument is, or the majority of this argument is about who controls this critical passage from north to south through the Caucasus. And in 2008, when NATO via Georgia attempted to make a play here, this was the first moment that that Russia really reached out and reasserted itself militarily and quashed that. That was it was a great disappointment for me, because I was supposed to go to visit Kabardino-Balkaria to do a conference on historical aspects of Circassian tribal marks, and it was canceled because of that. Another thing that we should mention is that we have Abkhazia, which is somewhere in this area, if I'm remembering correctly. Forgive me if my knowledge of the geography and locations here is less than it should be. But Abkhazia is historically, they're sort of like very close cousins of the Circassians. Their languages are similar. The Circassian peoples were, of course, driven out in the course of the Russo-Circassian Wars, Russian Caucasian Wars in the 19th century. Many of them were driven to Turkey. They have a diaspora population in the Middle East as well, and a few of them in New Jersey, as a matter of fact, Circassians in general. But the Abkhaz were always a group that that were, I believe, they're right up in here. They were not well inclined towards Russia generally because of what had happened to the Circassians because of the Russians during that period of war. But against all my expectations, they aligned themselves with Russia, and Russia recognized them, cutting off another chunk of Georgia, and has to date maintained them here. And this gives Russia additional access to the coastline of the Black Sea, and it gives them a proxy here, or a staging point south of the Caucasus, where Western powers have been trying to drive them out. Georgia has of late, it seems to me, been trying to walk on a knife edge to maintain a balance because of what's going on in the region. If it turns out that Russia is successful in Ukraine, it will be very easy, or relatively, certainly easier than now, for Russia to reassert itself in Georgia. And there's a lot of talk of Georgia being on a fast track to enter NATO, as well as other places like Moldova over here. These are all part of the game of NATO trying to get control of the Black Sea, which is why Russia pushed back and took Crimea back in 2014 after all the craziness started. Also, over here in Romania, you have NATO's Black Sea headquarters, and Romania is in NATO now, as well as an EU member. So essentially, NATO, the EU, the United States, they're trying to push their influence into the Black Sea, which has always sort of been an area that is contested between the Turks and the Russians, but with the Russians being a somewhat more powerful player in this area. I probably don't need to remind everyone here that we had the Crimean War, 1854, or thereabouts, if I remember correctly, where the French and the English allied with the Turks in a major way for the first time and attempted to invade here with or to hammer the Russians here with considerable success, considerable and brief success in that respect. So this is a whole area of the Great Game. It's also important because China wants to be able to transport things over land and bring them to Europe and cut down transport times. The EU wants this route as well. It's also very, very important for energy. For the moment, a lot of energy is coming out of Azerbaijan, and it's running across this area. And as most of you will know, Europe is having quite a bit of trouble with energy at present. Turkey is attempting to become a player in all of this. It's trying to become a transit corridor and is having considerable success in this, but it's flirting with BRICS on the one hand and trying to balance itself against Russia on the other hand. Let me show you here the, there we go. No, this one. There are a number of routes that are in place and they're trying to develop them further. They're primarily working in terms of energy. These pipelines that run into Turkey and are distributed from there. I believe they're also doing this through Georgia with rail. And their pipelines, if they're not complete, this is from 2023, they're expected to be completed. But you see, you've got Azerbaijan and Georgia that have been cooperating in this way, and the World Bank's very much into this kind of thing, and the EU thinks it's just, grand. But there's really not anything going through Armenia here. Now, if we take a look at the map, we can see that, as I said before, this is very, very rough country. So Armenia is not necessarily an easy place to move your stuff through in any case. You can see it's very mountainous. And also you've got an arrangement here, which, if I'm not mistaken, Matt can correct me here in a minute, because I swear I will shut up momentarily. But there's a division here with Azerbaijan, which you can see here. Let me click it to a simpler map. I guess that's as good as I'll turn terrain off. There we go. Well, it's not really helping, but you can see Azerbaijan, and then somewhere, if I remember right, it's just about in this area. I probably don't have it exact. Once upon a time, up until just the last year or two, there was an Armenian exclave here called Nagorno-Karabakh, which has been a long-standing point of contention between Azerbaijan and Armenia. Then you see Armenia running down through here, and then here around Nakhchivan, you've got an Azerbaijani enclave. And really the borders of these states, again, perhaps Matt can correct me, but I believe they come out of the period of Soviet consolidation of this area, and if not, late Russian imperial drawing of lines upon maps. And Armenia, while an ancient nation in the sense of a group of people, certainly if I remember correctly, the oldest church ever formed in Europe. I think that, church of or in Jerusalem is older, but otherwise in Europe, this is the oldest church going. They're an ancient people with an ancient culture and cultural continuity, but they've been very much a diaspora population. And because they have lived like the people who are called Azerbaijani today under the Persians, under the Imperial Persians, under the Imperial Ottomans, under the Imperial Russians, under the Soviet Union, these lines on the map are a vestige of great games that were played once upon a time. It seems, to me anyway, that the goal was for Russia or the Soviet Union, which at the time had, secure control of Georgia, to maintain a corridor that would run north-south into Iran. And there are plans for a north-south corridor that are being developed at present for Russia, for the BRIC states, for these other groups. So for Russia, strategically, it was important to split the Turkic-speaking groups. For those of you who don't know, the Azerbaijanis basically speak Turkish. Instead of saying ban, which means, I or me, instead of saying ban, they say man. But otherwise, Turks and Azerbaijanis can, understand each other's languages without any trouble at all. So this was a way for the Russians to basically recognizing and supporting Armenia was a way for Russians to split this group and a way for them to maintain a corridor running north-south into Iran. This is a good spot for me to stop because it looks like our second guest has arrived, and I can, at this point, allow Matt to introduce himself, allow Naré to introduce herself, and also to see what both of them think I might have missed in this general geopolitical introduction. Let me just test the sound. Naré, can you hear me?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, coming through loud and clear. Thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me.
Excellent. It's my pleasure. Okay, well, we were just going through a sort of description of the geopolitical situation here in terms of the great powers, Iran to the south of Armenia and Azerbaijan, Russia to the north, Turkey interested in overland corridors to its Azeri cousins, and of course, over into Central Asia, the stands, as they're called, Europe's energy interests in this area, particularly with the Black Sea now being contested and their former plans about being able to pull energy out of the Black Sea, having been thrown into disarray by events in Ukraine at present. Of course, China has an interest across this region. So I just went over a good bit of that and gave a sort of brief introduction about Armenia. Perhaps you and Matt can jump in and tell us a little bit more after introducing yourselves. Let's start with Matt.
Well, hi. Yeah, thanks. That was a fantastic introduction there. Really good. There are probably a few points I'd just like to highlight from what you said, and maybe if you could bring the map up, that might help as well. Just from there, that's fantastic. Now, from the start, the northern Caucasus, this border, I think, as you rightly identified, it's a massive border. Getting anything through north and south is really hard. There are basically three ways through. The first is on the west, on the Caspian side, through Abkhazia, as rightly said. Now, this is very hard land. I mean, traditionally, there probably was not much movement going down there because you'd move stuff by ship rather than on land. It's very tough stuff.
And that coast, the coast there is very narrow. So that's the west on the Black Sea. Yes, Abkhazia. And the coastline there is very narrow, right up against the mountains. Yes, and Derbent in the east.
And and indeed on the west, it's like tough land to get through. I mean, there's a little tale. I've just been drinking some Georgian tea that comes from that region, and if you can imagine, like the sort of land in Sri Lanka or Darjeeling or whatever where tea is grown, I mean, it's thick, jungly land that's hard to get through. There is, however, a railway that is currently not operative, but may be reopened that we may talk about later, that will connect to the rest of Georgia that runs down there. The central Georgian military highway route is it actually doesn't quite go through Ossetia. It goes very, very close to Ossetia, but it is Georgia proper. The highway runs right the way through what is still Georgia up to the border, and then just beyond that.
Yes, thank you for the
Vladikavkaz.
Vladikavkaz
in Russian meaning, of course, Lord of the Caucasus, which tells you something.
Yes, that was that spur I mentioned earlier. Thank you for the correction. I believe the original one that Yermolov built is running through Ossetia, and I believe the Georgians have tried to carve a route out around it, which is the modern and currently more preferred route.
And so, for instance, in 2008, when the brief sort of Russian-Georgian Ossetian War took place, that was the route that Russia moved its troops down. But clearly it is very close to Ossetia, and maintaining a presence in Ossetia makes sense from Russia from that perspective, even though it doesn't actually occupy what is now the main route. It also is incredibly close to the main oil and gas pipeline that runs from Baku up through Tbilisi and then down through Kars and then into the main part of Turkey. The third route, obviously, is the Caspian coastal route that runs through Dagestan to Baku. This traditionally was the main way that armies or whoever moved through. It's called the Caspian Gates or the Gates of Derbent, and was fortified. And the control of that, basically, until Russia was a power, the interests of both the whatever powers were occupying Iran and initially the Byzantines, and then obviously subsequently the Seljuks and Ottomans in what is now Turkey. The interest basically was to keep those, to keep the hordes from the steppes coming through there and invading the rich developed lands of those two empires to the south. Again, there are it is a route through there now, but it's not much used, and I'm sure will be developed more in future if the powers have anything to do with it. Just one other thing I'd probably like to highlight is the other interesting power that is getting more involved in the area is actually India. Now, India is clearly, as it always has been, a non-aligned power in terms of the sort of global geopolitics game. In a sense, I think it's almost the case that India is looking at the Caucasus, and particularly Armenia, as a way of testing how to behave on the world stage. India wants a route, obviously, that avoids Pakistan. We probably don't need to explain why that is. Currently, in order to ship from India to the west, you've got to entirely go by sea and through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. So at the moment, the best route that's an alternative to that is to unload in Iran, in Bandar Abbas, which is a sort of old and underdeveloped port. India is building or Iran is building with Indian finance a new port on the basically the southern part of Iran there, and the idea is that it will introduce a rail link that then comes up to Tehran and through to be able to transport goods more easily there. That's early days, but yeah, that's another thing to bear in mind. Talking about ports as well, the other thing is that Russia has very recently, as in I think earlier on this year, funded and opened a new naval port in Abkhazia, in a place called Shamchira. So it is, which is sort of, you can probably see it just in the somewhere about that, probably about there. I think that's it. Very rapidly developed port to, for obvious reasons, to give Russia a different outlet onto the Black Sea. Now, I could probably talk about the situation with Armenia, but as we have Naré here, maybe it's time to hand over, and thank you.
Yes, one quick thing you did want to mention, and we can just give a quick nod to it. The linguistic diversity here is staggering. The number of different ethnic groups. In some cases, you've got a village, so high up in the mountains that the clouds are below them, and they can look across the valley to another village, and the one village and the other will be the only two speakers I'm perhaps exaggerating just slightly, but only slightly, of some ancient language that only survives here. So you've got the Vainakh people, you've got the Circassians falling into separate groupings. There are different linguistic groupings even within the part of Georgia that's not contested by Russia. You've got the Ossetis over here. That's an Indo-European language. The Northwest Caucasian languages, the ones in Dagestan, the Lak people. They're the Ingush, the Chechens. It's a crazy mix, which adds to the sort of perforated lines in the region that can be exploited by great powers. But yes, Naré has been waiting very patiently. Thank you for coming in. You're actually from the region. How would you introduce both yourself and then the region and its situation more broadly?
Well, I mean, I was born in Yerevan, so in the middle of the Transcaucasian Great Game, and this corridor actually, it's not really a new idea, as Turkish Azeri project has been around for more than a century, and a bunch of Armenian nationalists were always writing about it, warning Armenia that these two countries want to sort of join over Armenia's grave. And I guess the Artsakh liberation movement in the 90s delayed those plans a little bit, even though in negotiations the West was also like kind of pushing for, maybe we will give you some of like the Artsakh, because Artsakh doesn't actually have, like, the NKO, the former autonomous oblast, it doesn't really have a border with Iran, so it's like irrelevant geopolitically. So they wanted Armenia, one of the projects was to give away control over like the rayons around it that they had sort of liberated as like a buffer zone, and there's connections to like Iran, to Armenia. And in exchange, they wanted to take over Mehri. Mehri is the southern part of Armenia that connects it to Iran. And essentially, Armenians always called it the lifeline, because starting from 1993, when this war started, Turkey, of course, supported Azerbaijan fully instead of taking a more like a neutral regional approach. And they closed the border. So Armenia ended up in like a bit of a blockade. And then Georgia started pursuing this pro-Western, after having a bunch of revolutions. Well, they didn't really have control over Abkhazia, Ossetia since the 90s. Like, they lost that pretty early on. And then they started having this like color revolutions. And effectively, one of them resulted in Saakashvili attacking Abkhazia, Ossetia. And of course, Russia, its red lines were crossed, so it had no other choice but to just defend, recognize. And so now, by the way, Georgian government, the Georgian dream, is moving away from this and just trying to issue apologies to Abkhazians, Ossetians, and trying to like regulate the issue of these territories like within Georgia's like territorial integrity. So now, of course, as you know, Artsakh is fully like ethnically cleansed. Last year, Azerbaijan took control of it and, shelled it. This is about time, like last September, they started shelling the Artsakh Armenians. And this was done because, of course, they had Armenia's full consent in this. Prime Minister, so-called Prime Minister Pashinyan, again, was like installed in like 2018 color revolution. This was one of the many attempts that they were doing. One was in 2008, and then it continued in 2018. They started again, and this time succeeded in installing Pashinyan, who then he pulled the Armenian army out of Artsakh, also known as Nagorno-Karabakh, and recognized it as essentially Azerbaijan. So now, essentially, they're like as close as possible to having this corridor that's probably going to, be Turkey's way to just absorb Azerbaijan, have entry to Middle Asia, Central Asia. But then there's also Iran. For Iran, this is like a red line because they want to prioritize. For them, like this is a matter of diversification. This connection to Georgia, to the Black Sea is very important to them. And they know that the long-term plan is to construct this one Turkish belt with whole of South Caucasus just acting as a way to like isolate Iran in the north. And yeah, this is pretty much it. But Russia's position has been that this is really funny. I found this out recently. Our first Prime Minister, Vazgen Manukyan, said that Russians, Yeltsin or Gorbachev, one of them, right after this USSR fell apart, they said that Russia said that they don't care who is in power in Azerbaijan because Azerbaijan is always going to be collaborating with these outside forces like, Turkey, Britain, and that they don't really care about who's in power in Armenia because where are Armenians going to go? Armenians don't really have a viable alternative to like Russian forces like guaranteeing their security in like this kind of like where Turkish factor is a threat. And but they said that they really care who is in power in Georgia. So now I guess both Armenia and Azerbaijan are now I think South Caucasus is like on its way like militarily into being this one unit in a sense. This is its origins back in the beginning of last century. This was whole like this Transcaucasian conglomerate before it fell apart. Now the West has been working very hard to like return it to its primal state of like all three being sort of NATO dominated countries. And of course, because they're like smaller countries, they have fewer means of resisting this. And Armenia was probably like the last to fall to this. And recently Turkish, Azeri, Georgian military exercises were conducted. And I think the current trajectory of the Armenian occupational government is to just have Armenia join them. But I don't think that Iran and Russia are going to be very happy about this. Yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely the way it has seemed to me. So it's encouraging to hear someone who is there and knows much more about it confirm that. To me, it seems preposterous, even in the medium term, to imagine that Iran and Russia are going to permit this. I mean, it seems to me, and it seems that you've confirmed it, looking at it from the outside, yes, Georgia did seem to be tipping over in the direction of the West, and there are still all sorts of motions made in that direction, but it seems the government there knows which side of their toast has the butter on it. Certainly, they're going to wait to see the results of the military conflict in Ukraine before they make any final decision, because they know it could lead to very real problems for Georgia if they prematurely make a move in one direction or the other before things are really locked in there in Ukraine in terms of, some de facto, some real victor, as opposed to, proclaimed a victory like, Zelensky is now in the West trying to figure out how to sue for peace, and he's calling it a victory plan. But Georgia does seem to be going more in the direction of Russia, certainly for the moment, and I think it will be locked in more completely if Russia is clearly successful in Ukraine. But in terms of Armenia and Azerbaijan, I can certainly see how the Turks are playing a game there. NATO and the Brits, as far as I know, have never had much success there. They were sending people like James Bell and what was his name? Urquhart, I believe, was the Scotsman. The the typical thing of, the great explorer who also just happened to be a British spy, who went to help organize the tribes against the terrible imperial powers of the Ottomans or the Russians or the Persians, or, fill in the blank. They have attempted to do those sorts of things, but the Circassians, for example, the Adige and the rest of them, Abaza, Abkhaz, they learned their lesson, because during the Crimean War, the British made all sorts of promises of support and then just disappeared and left them. And the Russians pushed the Circassians into the sea, and their diaspora community is to this day spread all over the place. Very few of them, relatively speaking, even remaining in the area. They were pretty thoroughly cleansed. So they're coming back, and perhaps the Abkhaz are in a better position than most of them ended up. I mean, the Ubykh are simply extinct. They're gone now. So it seems to me unlikely that in the short term, anything other than the short term, it seems unlikely that the West is going to be successful here. Turkey very well could end up being economically turned away from the West via things with BRICS and the rest. I'm sure they want to keep their toast with butter on both sides, or kaymak, or whatever it is that they put on their toast. Balve kaymak. But militarily, they'll want to stick with the West, I believe. But economically, they're being pulled eastward. The EU does not have the military force to do anything on its own, and the United States is very, very, very far away from the South Caucasus. Then we've got Iran, which certainly has no interest in seeing a knife cut them away from Russia and from the north. And one other player that I guess we should put in here that I would like to ask your opinion on is Israel. As best I understand, Israel has engaged in quite a bit of support of Azerbaijan, both intelligence support, technology support, military technology. And if I'm not mistaken, they may have even provided weapons directly. And if they haven't, they've certainly consulted with the Azerbaijanis about how to develop their military, because it serves their interest in terms of encircling Iran from the north. What do you make of the situation with Israel in this region, and more generally of the prospects of NATO and the West being able to extend its influence here in anything beyond the short term?
Well, Larry?
You go
You're
ahead.
able to me. Oh, okay. I think it's not a secret that Israel is a major supporter of Azerbaijan. That we can track weapons flights that go from Israel to Azerbaijan. Depending on what's happening, sort of almost daily. Sometimes it's also quite a not even a very kept secret that Israel probably has access to an air base in Azerbaijan that is there if it needs it. One thing we need to note about Azerbaijan is that there are actually more Azeris that live in that northwestern part of Iran than in Azerbaijan proper. Now, Iran doesn't keep census records that are at all exact about this, but there's probably 15 to 20 million Azeris living in Iran compared to Azerbaijan proper. So it's an obvious way of, as it were, attacking the sort of ethnic underbelly of Iran to try to foment discord there. Equally, Iran may think that it could take back its historic lands at some stage, but that's another matter. In terms of Azerbaijan, NATO, and things, yes, there hasn't been obviously any sort of military alliance, but we need to look at who has, since independence and pretty much since the day of independence, led and funded the oil and gas industry of Azerbaijan, and it has been BP, who of course started life out as the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, and basically moved their interests out there and into Azerbaijan. I think they've invested something like $100 billion since 1991 in the various Chardonnays and oil field projects and the pipelines that go in there. I think there is some pretty good evidence that BP were should we say, supporters of the coup that took place back when Aliyev's father came to power in Azerbaijan. They're significant in the regime there.
Naré, your thoughts?
Yeah, well, about 80% of the weapons that Azerbaijan used in the ethnic cleansing of Artsakh were supplied by Israel. So for the longest time, Armenia and Azerbaijan were mainly supplied by Russia. And so there was this, the status quo of Nagorno-Karabakh Republic being controlled by Armenia was maintained, because there was like a parity. And even in 2016, when Azerbaijan trying to like reclaim some control, they did not succeed. So as the Israeli weapons were really key in like tipping the balance and like changing the game. It was this and the regime change operation in Armenia. And now Israel sort of like there's this after the 2020 war, one of my friends said that Israel finally got its own Lebanon against Iran. So now they're building these military airports. They're building these bases. So even as one of the rumored ways the president of Iran suggested they retaliate was to strike the Israeli forces in Zangilan, which is, the part of NKR that Azerbaijan recently reclaimed. And Azerbaijan now, it's fueling the genocide in Gaza, providing, I think, more than 50%. So it's like a really fruitful relationship. And even though Israel is fighting on many fronts, they still supply Azerbaijan every day. You can still see the planes with weapons flying to Baku, and we'll see how and when they will be used, because Aliyev is always like, renewing vows, renewing the threats. And I think the biggest, the country that matters the most to the West right now is Georgia. They have like an elaborate plan to return Georgia to its like Western course with this October 26 elections. And the president Zurabashvili, which is on the Western sort of camp, has made all the oppositional forces sign like a pact, which means that they will, if they get power, if they win in these elections, they will undo a lot of what Georgian Dream has been trying to accomplish in terms of having, Georgia go its own way with its own national interests and not allowing there to be like a second front opened against Russia. So this is essentially what Georgian Dream is selling to the population. Essentially, it's a peace promise. And we'll see how that goes. But the stakes are very high, because also the main opposition faction has promised to release Saakashvili if they succeed. So because it's like, of course, the opposition is the party founded by Saakashvili, who has now, I think, 3 or 4 cases against him. So we'll see how it unfolds in Georgia. I mean, on the long term, I don't really think that the West is going to succeed, just because like there are so many powerful like regional forces, and Turkey is not really, always playing for one side. And they're always, primarily thinking about their own like regional power and the expansion eastward. So on the long term, maybe not, but right now they seem to be doing well for themselves.
Well, I have a sort of second question, because there's another player that I think we should introduce here, and I don't think it's going too far afield, because it does matter in terms of Eurasia. China, the big issue with China is that it is this sort of sucking hole. It needs raw materials for manufacturing, and it needs energy. And it's most threatened by the historic naval power, first of Britain, now of the United States. And so anything happening on the high seas, could be an issue for it. And now it's building a blue water navy. It's attempting to get truly into the force projection game, but it's not there yet. And prior to what I view as the colossal stupidity from a Western perspective of the war in Ukraine, Russia and China were very much competitors in terms of Central Asia. Now, what Russia has, it already has rail networks running east to west. It already touches the Pacific and the Baltic and the Black Sea and the Arctic. So it was already a viable player for overland trade. And the value of overland trade is that it's not subject to U.S. naval interdiction. After Ukraine, Russia was, of course, driven very closely into China's arms. I mean, as closely as it can be. I'm not saying it's going to be perfect. I'm not even saying it's going to last. But for the time being, that's about as closely pushed together as these two powers could be. And this means that Russia is more willing to do things with China, like logistical corridors, and to provide China with energy. Now, China historically had been pushing its own route that I've talked about many times on this channel. They had moved ever westward into this whole area, towards Afghanistan. And in fact, they've got military bases here by the Wakhan corridor. And it is very easy to imagine a coming situation in the not too distant future where China has an overland route to Iran. And that will get them to the Caspian, to the Persian Gulf. And then from there, in theory, they can develop an overland route. And they've been working on this for quite some time. To some extent, for the time being, that's not as critical for them to have a route that runs south of Russia, where they're not subject to Russia doing overland interdiction again. But, this just for the time being. But what do either of you know? Matt, you brought up India and their potential interest here, which is interesting. What do the two of you know about China? Would you like to start, Matt, and then we'll move to Naré?
I'll take it from a slightly different angle, but between China and those powers, we've also got what people tend to call the stans, which are a huge and I think going to be increasingly important geopolitical balance point. At the moment, Kazakhstan, which is obviously that massive part there, is the largest supplier of uranium to the world market, also a very, very significant oil and gas supplier. Turkmenistan to the south has traditionally been the most reclusive and cut off of them, but is again another major energy player and is actually increasing its sort of diplomacy and interests with the outside world. Uzbekistan is the most populous and probably the least resource-rich of them, but the other two, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, there are massive mineral deposits in there. There are rare earths that have been discovered totally unexploited in both of them. Again, I think Tajikistan has recently sort of discovered some significant uranium seams that the Kazakhs are looking to exploit. This is a big area where when we talk about the sort of transportation corridors that go across, that will run from China through those to across the Caspian and coming out in Baku and Azerbaijan. There's a lot of development there, and exactly where they will sit between China and Russia is I think at odds at the moment. We should also say that particularly in Kazakhstan, which is like the most, as it were, developed of the economies of the resources of the region, against what you might expect, it's actually been Western interests that have funded all of that. I mean, over half, I don't know the exact number off the top of my head, but over half of the FDI that's gone into Kazakhstan has been from the EU. It hasn't been from China. It hasn't been from Russia. So the game really is afoot in those, and how Russia and China will balance them is, I think, to be seen. One thing I think, again, that we need to think in that is that if we're looking at more of a sort of bipolar new Cold War world, it's actually not in Russia's interests for China to dominate too much. If it's a simple, there are two poles as it used to be, then Russia actually, if things go as they are at the moment, is going to play second fiddle to China. So actually having a more sort of developed Turkic world is, I think, not in Russia's or not against Russia's interests over the medium to longer term. I think Russia does actually believe in the concept of multipolarity because it suits it.
Very good. Well, I have only one thing to add to that, and then let's turn it over to Naré. Thank you. The one thing I'd add is that we just recently, within the last 3 years, there was what appeared to be an attempt at overturning the government in Kazakhstan, and Russia came in, CSTO obligations and the rest. And I'm not clear on what really happened there, but it does seem like China and Russia exerted some influence, and that there's some sort of détente there. It does not seem like the people behind that, which I would have to assume are Western powers, were entirely successful. Kazakhstan seems to be playing a balancing act as well. I know there's quite a bit of Turkish investment in Kazakhstan, and in the days before, what's his name, Fethullah Gulen, before he fell from power, and back in the days when Erdogan was a partner or ally of his, they were putting enormous amounts of investment into this whole idea of pan-Turkism through the region. Of course, this is an ideology dear to the MHP, the Bozkurt, and the rest in Turkey. So Turkish nationalism, yes, has been activated across this area, and they're players there as well. But Naré, what are your thoughts on China and this whole picture?
Yeah, well, I agree with all of the things that you guys said. Mainly, I think it's that there's big competition between Turkey and Russia for influence over these areas, the stans, because all of these, they're all in CSTO, but they're Turkish populated countries. So this pan-Turkish project, which according to many Russian experts is a British project, it's trying to court all the stans. And I think recently they came up with their shared alphabet or some sort of a unified integration projects. But on the long terms, it is, it would be surprising for a country like Kazakhstan or Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan to just give away so much of their identity and just take Ankara as their ultimate center. It would be illogical. That would be a strange construct. But yeah, of course, there's this competing forces for influence. And I know China has been investing a lot in Georgia, building all these tunnels, a lot of Chinese investments there. And China is just very slow in ultimately maybe even pan-Turkism will become a problem for China with their Uyghurs. But we'll see.
Very good. Okay, well, if we can, and we didn't have a chance to talk before this about how much time both of you have. So as we approach the point where either of you have to go, please just let me know. I certainly don't want to keep you, but it's great to have you here where I can benefit from your knowledge. Let's jump into the region specifically, and perhaps you guys can correct me as I try to paint a picture here. As I understand it, the Armenians are very much a diaspora people, and have been for a very, very long time. When I lived in Turkey, pardon me?
I'm meh. What do you mean diaspora people?
Well, that they have existed across, during the period of the Ottoman Empire, there have been Armenian populations across the what was formerly the Ottoman Empire, going quite distance back into history. You know, they were a recognized millet, one of the populations of Turkey, of the Ottoman Empire, more properly speaking, and they have been spread across much of the Eastern world for a very long time. I'm not saying that they don't have deep roots in this place and that they don't have a culture. I'm certainly, you know, I'm not suggesting anything of the sort, but you've got them being a diaspora population in a way that I would imagine can be compared to Jews living in various places. But they have had a home area of their own for, you know, going back into ancient times. As I mentioned earlier, the earliest Christian church in Europe. It seems as though I need a correction here. Please correct me.
Well, you know, regarding Armenia, it's just, yes, before the formation of these nation states, before this came to this region, it was around 1918, so a little bit later on. But still, like, of course, before that, people just, you know, they all lived. It was like an area thing. It didn't really have this like defined thing. Now, of course, Armenians like have an ethno-state where, yeah, before they had, you know, this kingdoms, they had like Cilicia, Melissa, but then they were absorbed, I guess, into the Ottoman Empire. There was like the Russian Empire part, the Persian Empire part. And then in 1918, finally, like they sort of like regained statehood. They had, I think, the last kingdom, the Armenian kingdom, which was not in this area. I think it fell in the 14th century, 13 something. But yeah, you're right. I mean, before the genocide, the inhabitant of Armenians was like a lot larger, and this like areas immediately to the west, especially, were traditionally a part of the ancient like Armenian kingdoms. So I don't really think there's like a similarity with you know, Jews and Israels with this like formation and origins. But it just has been, I think, popularized like this. The fact that Armenians have this big diaspora because of the genocide has made them, you know, instead of viewing it as a political identity, people view it as an ethnic identity more.
And to be fair, I certainly should point out that once upon a time, you know, in the days of people like Tigranes, you know, when Mithridates Eupator was roaming about, Armenia was a vast kingdom. So I'm certainly not suggesting that they didn't have a geographic locus and the rest. But okay, so fair. Armenians, it seems, do not like the comparison. And that's fair enough.
It's just not really all that accurate, you know, like in terms of origins of the states. But I mean, when you say diaspora, it's like, I think you just need to like clarify it a bit more. It's not that I don't like it. I just want to, you know, tell you a bit more about our history. That's it.
I mean, that area they're looking at in the center of the map, you know, is known as the Armenian Highlands. Those vilayets in, you know, what is the east of Turkey now and would have been the east of the Ottoman Empire at the time were you know, the majority or the largest population of them, you know, prior to the genocide were Armenians. So, you know, there is a sense in which, you know, what we see as the Republic of Armenia now is you know, the shrunken remnants of you know, where what was a much larger spread of Armenians around the whole area until the genocide.
Yes, but we didn't really have political control over those areas for a long time. Mm-hmm.
And so it seems that, and I was watching an interview you had done previously, Naré, and you made the interesting point that Armenia seems to, the fate of Armenia seems to lie, if it is to have a future, you know, so far as I understand these things as very much an outsider, that it lies historically with Russia defending this Christian kingdom that is nestled between, you know, with the exception of Georgia, amidst these, not between, but amidst these other Muslim powers, both Sunni to the east and west, and Shia to the south, and so I want to bring this to the subject of Russian interests as well as Iranian, and so I wonder if you could sketch the ways in which Russia has been a supporter of Armenia and how that has recently changed, or how Pashinyan seems to be doing his best to change that.
When Armenia and Azerbaijan started, when there was this Karabakh Liberation War, Armenia needed support in protecting its border with Turkey and border with Iran. So in 1992, it invited Russia. They signed a pact. And since then, until to this day, Russia is protecting the borders with Turkey and Iran. So that's one thing. Another thing is they manage the waste from our nuclear plant. It's like a plant since USSR times. We've had it for a long time, and Russians plan to extend its life till 1936. But of course, Pashinyan is coaxed by the West to change the energy sector, and even ideas on defending on Azerbaijan for oil have been thrown around, which is comical considering that with Azerbaijan, as you guys said, there's BP and there's Turkey, and they don't even for their internal use they have to import fuel themselves, because the volumes are falling, and they even act as this cover for Russian gas export, as we know. But yeah, so Pashinyan is trying to change the energy sector. Samantha Power thinks that it's a priority for us. Then there's the Russian base in Gyumri, the 102nd base. And there's that Pashinyan ideally would also want to get rid of. There was the brief presence of ineffective peacekeepers in Artsakh. Russia gives us gas at good rates. The equivalent is I think a few $1 billion of investments. We get I guess only Belarus gets better rates than we do. There is that. Oh yeah, it's our biggest export market. Even our lackluster apples are absorbed into Russia. It's
Sorry.
It's true. Yeah, so in this sense, again, Georgia becomes very important for us. But recently, as the Western overlords have been telling Pashinyan to move away from Russia, the emergence of Iran as the guarantee of Armenian Sunnik has occurred, because Iran has been so clear that this is their red line. And historically we just have I guess closer cultural ties to Persia. A big percent of our language is actually shared. The words are shared. For example, the word for jam, murabba, is the same. So I think that there's a lot of untapped potential there with Iran. In terms of security too, Tehran has said that they're ready to get into a pact with Armenia at any time, which is nice. Considering that in Russia, one of the sort of lobbying groups that's lobbying the Kremlin, according to their experts, is saying that they don't even need the base in Gyumri, that losing Armenia is not really going to mean all that much for their loss of influence in South Caucasus. So we know that there's this wing in Russia, in Moscow's politics, and you shouldn't always put all your eggs in the Russian basket. We know how that may turn out. But yeah, I mean, we haven't had any military exercises with Russia since 2018, which is when Pashinyan seized power. No parades, no exercises with anybody. So effectively, Armenia is choosing demilitarization. And this is, again, I think one of those, yeah, and sometimes we just do this performative gestures to Ukraine. We hope that they appreciate it. But we don't really support them in any essential way, I guess, in the conflict. Recently, we had a delegation from our city council visit the Naré, the Donetsk region. And I think it was one of the first, it was the first delegation from a post-Soviet country to go. Of course, it was from an opposition blog. So that's interesting. Okay.
And the I guess this brings us to the subject of I guess this general area here would be the proposed Zanzibar corridor here along the border with Iran, if I understand things correctly. And
there are many possibilities. There's also they always threaten to cut it off also in Vyotzor, which is, as you see, like a little bit further north, like this narrow part over there. So yeah, so that is also, I guess, but if they choose to do it militarily. But if Pashinyan agrees to the corridor, and he will likely agree to it, it will just be like a gradual frog boiling, stage by stage, like seizure of control. For example, Pashinyan's administration, they discuss outsourcing it to a private company. And of course, like, it's going to seem like a very nice Western private company, and then gradually we will see that actually, like, Turkey and Azerbaijan have a lot of leverage over it. Maybe they just start putting pressure militarily, and then ultimately the end goal is to just cut off Armenia from Iran.
And how can and I submit this question to both of you. Maybe we can just start with Matt, just to be able to bring him in. How is it that you guys can imagine that Iran would tolerate this chopping away of their access north-south over land to Georgia and presumably up through Russia? And how is it, even with people in the Duma or the rest, other groups in Russia suggesting such things, how is it strategically that Russia could tolerate this? I mean, I understand that sometimes you don't have to like it, right? The outside powers can force things to come through, but because of Iran's interests in this regard, and because presumably of Russia's, it seems very difficult for me to imagine that they're going to allow this to happen. And I do believe there are a few thousand Russian peacekeepers in this area, are there not? Still?
The Russian peacekeeper, well, their army bases are still there, but I think there are some very helpful European Union observers on the border now, aren't there, who carefully note when troop movements happen and but don't have the power to do anything. I entirely agree. I mean, Iran has clearly said that it won't tolerate any sort of border changes in the region,
and has massed troops there, right?
So Iran
Yes.
has. Yes, it has sometimes. Yes, but and indeed, in order, I think partially, I think Naré probably would be better on this, but in order to partially to avoid the or to present a different solution to the idea of a territorial Zangezur corridor. Iran has facilitated transport links between Nakhchivan, which is the exclave there that borders Turkey, that has no land border to Azerbaijan proper, through it, in order to I think diffuse the argument. The question, as ever with Iran, is that when something happens, they're very good at sitting back on their hands and playing the long game, and they certainly haven't been active in changing anything. in terms of border changes as well, I think, Naré, you probably ought to talk a little bit about what Pashinyan is doing with actually basically negotiating away, I say negotiating, like giving away in very strategic land on the borders of Armenia with Azerbaijan.
Yes, this is true. They made sure to seize all the high grounds so that, if anything, they will be very, very well placed, well positioned to do a military attack. And the investments in Aliyev's investments in the military continue to expand. And actually, today they said they blamed Armenia that it's stalling negotiations, and said that their number one priority is military strength. So there is that. Of course, like when there were these accumulations along the border, and Azerbaijan in 2022 was shelling Jermuk, which is just a part of the Republic of Armenia on the eastern border. Of course, Iran also like amassed troops. There have been a number of such cases that there was this danger, and there was a clear sort of demarcation of red line. So I think the way that they will try to do it is to have Armenia give it away voluntarily, like they've been doing with Artsakh, like they've been doing with all these territories. So the procedures are formally called like demarcation, peace, delimitation. So they have all this great branding, but what's going on in reality is that Azerbaijan is trying to seize control of actually like even control of the water resources. Yeah, because now they control the Arpa River that, essentially like it goes into Sevan. So that's also a very important feat for them. Because you know how Turkey has been with managing the water resources in Syria.
Managing. Yes, managing them.
And so I think the strategy will be Pashinyan, in its eternal sovereignty, decides to give away control of this corridor to a very nice private firm, and then maybe in a few years it will be like militarized. So I mean, I don't really know if the plan is to also like get this corridor militarily. The alternative plan could be when Iran is somehow busy elsewhere, because there have been all these provocations, and in fact even the name Azerbaijan, when it was being made up, Iran strongly protested against it because it's their northwestern region. As Matthew mentioned, the normal ethnic Azeris live there, and the abnormal ones live in the Baku Republic. So, yeah, I mean, Iran could have acted when Artsakh people were being ethnically cleansed last year. But again, this is traditionally, since I guess Turkmenchai is the Russian influence zone. And I guess Russia has been giving all these promises and guarantees that it's going to manage somehow to keep this from happening to Iran. But Iran is very skeptical given the Russian track record.
Yeah, looking at it again, of course, from the outside, it's striking the hypocrisy. I mean, all geopolitical rhetoric is strikingly hypocritical, but in this case, you can see, I mean, I just watched in preparation for this stream, I watched some of the Western takes on what's happening here, and it's very much like a national public radio saccharine voice saying, hopes for a fragile peace, and Pashinyan is showing has the bravery to be willing to make the hard decisions to make peace possible. And so in Ukraine, you hear them saying, how dare you suggest that we surrender 1 inch of territory for peace. And in Armenia, the very same people are saying, how dare you suggest that we shouldn't trade territory for something as important as peace. And I mean, other than being sort of nauseating, as again most political rhetoric is. In this case, it makes me wonder. There's a strong tradition of nationalism in Armenia, and even among Armenians living in other countries. I was in Nishantashire on the day when Hrant Dink was shot there in Turkey. I mean, there are Armenian nationalists all over the place, and I would have thought that there is a very strong tradition of Armenian nationalism in Armenia itself. And so one of the big questions for me is how on earth two questions. One, how on earth did someone like Pashinyan come to power? And beyond that, how has he managed to remain in power? I mean, I don't want to suggest that I would endorse any such thing, but how is it that he's even still alive with what he's doing? I mean, what on earth is going on there?
Yeah, well, that's the question on everyone's mind. How is Pashinyan still alive and moreover still in power, given everything? But you have to look back into the narratives and the, I guess, material conditions of the independent Republic of Armenia, because in the 90s too, there was immediately this defeatist president, Levon Petrosyan. He was always talking that we can't win the war, we cannot protect the Armenians of Artsakh, we cannot hold on to the lands that we have liberated, even though we were always willing to barter for the admission of the Nagorno-Karabakh republics, just right to self-determination. So it was supposed to be like status in exchange for the territories that we had taken. Anyway, so he was always, and then that became the official line, and it was because Armenia, I guess, didn't really have a lot of this defenses set up, much like Ukraine, right? Like these young states, they don't really have institutional defenses against color revolutions, against, seizing power. And the main narrative via, Radio Freedom, CivilNet, they created 1,000 satellites. So in Armenia today, you would hear maybe, 150 pseudo experts claiming that actually what's preventing this corridor is, for example, collaboration of the West, Pashinyan, and Iran, a very absurd things that maybe for people that I guess only know Armenian or are not sufficiently informed. It's just that one issue is the media sphere, is that it's completely taken over. So in order to make change possible, you need to also cleanse it a little bit. So there needs to be a coup. And it is under these conditions where the political powers that were, quote, quote, dethroned in 2018, they were not really revolutionaries. They were people that just divided up the country in some way, as one does, in like a post-Soviet type of normal situation. And then they just have their businesses, they have their everyday concerns. They're not revolutionaries. So in order for Pashinyan to be removed, and he's protected by quite a number of special security forces, and he has given all this, Mossad, Turkish, MIT, all of them free ground to operate in Armenia and to persecute all our generals, all our heroes. And, the Artsakh presidents are now kept in Baku. They're imprisoned. And Pashinyan continues criticizing them, saying that they were not real patriots, blaming them in this like small corruption schemes, like these little petty things. So in essence is that there needs to be a change in the opposition before there can be a change in the government. Like if you look at a similar situation in Georgia, Saakashvili was in power for like 10 years. Now, of course, Georgia didn't really have this like history, a very strong like nationalist sentiment that actually led to it protecting its population, militarily. But still, it took them a while to have an oligarch have this like political bid and put Georgian Dream that also had to pretend to be very like Western oriented, because the political landscape of Georgia was already set up in this way. So similarly, Pashinyan came to power pretending to be ultra nationalist. So for example, when in 2016 there was this 4-day war, he started blaming third president Sarkisian in giving away, this land that was the side of a football field, which is absurd. Then they started this, under the auspices of the West, this, again, another ultra-nationalist group. They seized a police station. They killed a policeman. This was in 2016, right after the war. So in order to come to power, they had to pretend that it was actually the former elite, the patriotic elites, that were planning to give away Artsakh, that were in cahoots with Azerbaijan, with Turkey, with the West, all these things.
Well, I certainly have noticed the trends that you're commenting on. Like this is a fairly recent article from the past few days, and it's talking about why Armenia is not applying to the ICC, and it's all a story about Pashinyan's saintly patience, and how peace is so important. But where was this particular passage? This was just unbelievable that I read. This is someone by the name of what's his name here? He's speaking to Styopa Safarian, and I believe is some former government figure. And he says, of course, they knew that Armenia is in a very weak position, and that even with a great desire to arrest Putin, we are not in a situation to do so. But Russia had a second concern. Putin understood that, backed by the West, Armenia was closing the window for war by Aliyev and Azerbaijan. So the whole argument here is that the West is making it impossible for Aliyev and Azerbaijan to make war on Armenia. Aliyev would think twice about attacking Armenia, knowing that he might be punished. Putin saw Aliyev's fear. That is why Putin was very, very aggressive. I mean, this is the most childish and absurd mischaracterization of the situation, as best I can tell. But it seems to be the standard, as you were saying, in terms of the media narrative that's being pumped out to the West. Do you have any thoughts on this, Matt?
Yeah, I mean, there are some remarkable articles that are coming out at the moment that are much along those lines. There was a wonderful one in Unheard just yesterday that was basically again, but that was sort of criticizing that Pashinyan for being too much of a nationalist, and that he was making the steps towards peace. It's remarkable what we're seeing. I think it's worth just taking a little a step back. I think certainly in our circles we're very happy that to say that Saakashvili coming into power in Georgia and the events of the Maidan were color revolutions. Very few people talk about what's happened in Armenia as a color revolution in the same way, and it was. But it's just not, I'm afraid it just hasn't reached any level of Western interest. Now, why is that? I think partially, you have to go back to what I was saying earlier about the interests of Britain and BP and Azerbaijan. It just doesn't hit our radar. It's interesting what's happening in Armenia as well in terms of the US presence now. It's much bigger than it has been. We've had incidences of Pashinyan's special police forces being trained by sort of US forces or police services on the ground. I think it was it the Kansas National Guard or something who were there earlier on this year. Again, now what does Armenia need in terms of sort of military or quasi-military assistance from the West. It's to protect its borders against Azerbaijan, and what actually has happened is that we've seen the influence on the ground seemingly to protect Pashinyan against any internal threats. It is quite remarkable what we're seeing now.
And then we're seeing people like David Lammy. There was recently a big fuss because he wrote in some blog post that Azerbaijan had been able to liberate territory from Armenia. And then I guess coming in afterwards trying to, clean up the dog's breakfast that Lammy had left on the floor. He said the UK supports the territorial integrity of both Armenia and Azerbaijan and is encouraged by both sides engaging in meaningful dialogue. We will continue to support their commitment to lasting peace in the region. It's really quite striking the way in which, they don't seem to be bothered at all by ethnic cleansing. Ethnic cleansing, which in some respect must be admitted to have been directly supported by Israel. And once again, as I said, they're all for giving up territory for peace in Armenia, but they're shocked at the suggestion in Ukraine. And I suppose it really is just a matter of these places being so far away and so little understood, if even known about at all, by the populations of these Western countries. But one thing that I'm curious about, though, the Armenian diaspora is very large in the United States, of course. Glendale comes to mind in California. But of course, everywhere else, I have a very close friend here in the American South who's comes from Armenian family. But there is supposedly, to the best of my knowledge, a very large Armenian diaspora community in France as well. And so I wonder, have these diaspora communities managed to have any success of any kind in influencing the governments, United States, France, in any way to address this situation? I remember once upon a time, there were many attempts to get the U.S. Congress to recognize the Armenian genocide officially. And if I remember correctly, it was recognized by France or the EU, one or the other. I can't quite recall. What is the position of the diaspora community on all of this, and have they had any success, or do they hope for any success in the future?
Well, firstly, Pashinyan's government is, because it's rejected by the diaspora for obvious reasons, now it's trying to create a parallel diaspora. So whenever the diaspora commissioner goes, he is, greeted by this diaspora Armenians that are outside of our traditional structures. I don't think that you can, in any meaningful way, change what U.S. Has in mind regarding this region, because neither U.S. nor France have any real vital interest in having Armenia. That only makes sense in the context of Iran and Russia. They would probably be completely fine geopolitically if Armenia was just a part of Azerbaijan, just a part of this one big Turkish belt. So I don't think you can influence that. And in terms of what we need, is that I don't really think that France or US even have they don't have the logistical capacity to support an Armenia militarily if Azerbaijan start something, because now we see planes flying from Israel with arms almost, I guess, every week, and they have been coming for years and years. And I don't really see the possibility of ever contracting that with, this sporadic bouquet of Western or Indian weapons that Armenia buys to just have something to show for it. That these weapons, they don't even work together, that they make no sense. They come from countries that don't really have a real interest in this region, other than to maybe kick out Russia and Iran. So in terms of recognition, recognition is, I guess we have US recognition, France recognition, all these countries, but I don't really think it's like a meaningful and very meaningful in a political sense. It doesn't really have many applications. It's just like a gesture when, you know, maybe the Turkish migrants pull something, or Erdogan is not really, you know, up to fuss. It's like just a way to show him his place a little bit. So there is that. In terms of
I was just going to say, if I'm right, Biden, or let's call the administration, recognized the genocide immediately before the ethnic cleansing of Artsakh.
a few years.
And no, I think it was close to that. And I heard that the ANCA, the Armenian National Committee of America, was actually consulted before the events of almost exactly a year ago, to ask how the Armenian population in the States would view it. You know, a State Department knew very well what was happening, and essentially, it's not a question of the Armenian diaspora in the States being able to influence policy. It's a question of to what extent they can manage what state is going to do in any event.
I don't think they have any capacity whatsoever to manage anything. You know, the U.S. police are so powerful, and their goals in this sense are so clear that I think Anka would just be better off lobbying for less diasporan influence, just to stay out of Armenia, instead of painting America in this like cutesy way, and then everybody's surprised when they act entirely in favor of putting Turkey in charge of everything that's going on in South Caucasus.
Yeah, but you've got to believe the myth of democracy, because the worst thing in the world is democratic backsliding. You don't want to be democratic backsliding now, do you?
Yeah, they've been saying that we've been backsliding for some time now. Yeah, I guess Pashinyan should worry about that. But yeah, as you mentioned, those alleged military trainings actually were just police trainings, because every year we have an Azeri attack and we have this police. By the way, since immediately after 2018, the US embassy put out a statement saying that after Nagorno-Karabakh issue is resolved, Armenia can move to successfully reduce its dependency on Russia. And then they gave us a whole bunch of money to reform the police to keep this guy in power. And now, villagers are even joking that the reason why they don't really have any criminals is because all the criminals have been recruited into this new police.
Yeah, and I think just before I was out, that didn't Pashinyan increase the pay of the police force by something like 50%?
Yes. Yeah, the military they don't really get paid much at all compared to our police. It's like the big new career. All the kids want to be it.
And which group of forces is larger? Is the police, the quote unquote police force side of the security system beginning to match or overmatching the military side?
You have to understand that a lot of the stats are being kept very confidential, and a lot of the negotiations are kept, behind the scenes. The public is constantly on edge and waiting for the next agreement with Azerbaijan they're going to throw at us. So even what we hear about the military, it's at odds with what the government is saying. For example, there have been a number of people laid off in this, artificial number of tests that they conducted. And so we know that it has been reduced, but we don't really know the accurate numbers. This is the same thing that they do in our educational system. They will, for example, they want to introduce all this global homo themes and stuff. And they will just say that all these old teachers are not up to par. They will organize this trainings. They're trying to introduce Turkish into Armenian schools. It's just zero respect for where Armenia actually is and what is going on around it and its history and values. It's pretty peculiar to observe because, as you mentioned, our nationalist forces, I think they don't really know how to deal with this new type of colonialism. As for example, I remember Ukrainians too, they were laughing after the Maidan of 2014 saying, oh, if we don't like the government, we will change it again. So Armenians were in the same position, after 2018. Oh, we know how it's done. But the reality is that to change the government, you need to have infiltrated its NSS, its army. You need to blackmail them and then present it with a beautiful ribbon as this big popular uprising, which John Bolton said it's not a very easy thing to organize. But they managed to do that.
And what we've sort of left out Georgia from this picture. Does Georgia have a position on what's happening in Armenia? Have they discussed it? I mean, after all, they're another country that shares a border with you, and they would presumably be affected by any sort of north-south logistical corridor if that were ever to be put into place through Armenia, rather than, for example, the Caspian, which seems a safer bet, surely, but...
Well, Georgia theoretically should also be opposed to this direct link, because they have this alternative pipeline, right? Baku, Ceyhan, Baku, Tbilisi, Ceyhan. So if there's any alternative infrastructure, this will surely reduce the meaning of this pipeline. So, I mean, that's one possible thing they could collaborate on. But I think Georgia doesn't really have the geopolitical weight. Its position on the inside is, I think, too shaky. But even the president, well, for example, right, what happened is when they introduced this law of having transparency of influence, what happened is a number of protesters, they threw Molotov cocktails at the police, and they, started, ruining the doors of the parliament, etc., etc. And then this guy that was throwing Molotov at the police, he was imprisoned, and they got a sentence for 4 years. But then the president herself recently, she released him, pardoned him. So this is a very fragile thing. This power is not consolidated on the inside. So I don't really think that Georgia has the weight to dictate its will on the outside. And with elections coming up, it's going to be interesting to observe to what point the West is willing to support the Saakashvili's party and the oppositional forces.
Yeah, I think that's probably going to be determined in large part by, what eventuates in Ukraine. I think, my impression has been that Georgia is just waiting and trying to keep their shit together and not have it all fall apart, because the tensions there in that country are intense, as best I can understand it. Well, I would then ask you guys, perhaps we can wrap here fairly soon, maybe, around the 2-hour mark. But with a little bit of time left, if you both have a bit more time, I would want to ask, first off, what have we missed in the discussion thus far, with particular attention from both of you, and particularly you, Naré. What do we in the West need to know about this? What has been missed? And then the last bit would be, I'd ask both of you for your thoughts about what the future holds. My guess is that much of it depends on what happens in Ukraine, but I expect that in Ukraine, and I long ago guessed, though I've been wrong in the past, but I long ago guessed that Russia was going to be the one that came out of that with the strongest claim to something approximating victory conditions. My guess is that Russia ultimately is not going to tolerate this, but it will probably turn its attention to Armenia after things are settled in Ukraine. And I certainly can't imagine that Iran is going to allow it to go on forever. But I'm not there, and I certainly don't have anything like your understanding of the situation. So yeah, what maybe start with Matt and then move to Naré. What have we missed here? What do people in the West need to know that hasn't been covered? What's the most important takeaway? I hate that expression, but takeaway that people should understand from all of this. And then what do you expect to happen in the future? What's your guess?
Well, I think probably the best place to start on that is we've talked about a little bit, but the elections that are coming up in a month's time in Georgia. The sort of level to which there's been, you might say, a sort of political switcheroo in between Georgia and Armenia in the South Caucasus is very striking. Georgia was in a sense, it was like Ukraine almost before Ukraine in terms of the influence of NATO and the West and the US in the former Soviet Union. There's probably not time to go into anything like the detail of the sort of level of infiltration that's gone on. But for example, if you look at the career of Saakashvili, I mean, he's like trained. He was trained by Brzezinski in the States and so on. As Naré said, the current president, Salome Zurashvili, she's actually a French Georgian who was parachuted in under the aegis of Georgian Dream before she broke away and became, one of the leading critics of the government. She's literally a cuckoo president by the West in there. At the same time, Georgian Dream, who have been in power since 2012, I think, when Saakashvili was finally put out of power, have played an interesting job of, as they like to say in the area, Euro-Atlantic aspirations are written into the constitution of Georgia, and they've played along with it very well until recently, when they're running a very, very different script. We've seen, the introduction quite recently that was trialed last year, but it finally became law this year of what the foreign influence law, which is actually incredibly moderate in any real way. It says that any NGO that receives more than 20% of its funding from overseas must declare it. Not that they're banned or anything, you just must say where your funding comes from. I think there are something like 25,000 NGOs registered in Georgia, and at least 3,000 most sort of major and active. And I think at this point, a handful of those have actually declared their foreign funding under this law. Something like, I saw an estimate, something like 90% of the funding of the NGO sector in Georgia comes from abroad, from the West. So it's, again, one of the buzzwords that we all know and love about this area is civil society. So, civil society is coming out as one against the Georgian Dream government and against this law that's known as the Russian law. We've also seen laws passed recently that, should we say, curtail the influence of the LGBT lobby in Georgia. Georgian Dream has increased the funding and increased the tax breaks of the Georgian church. If you think it's bad in Armenia, it's had decades of it in Georgia, and the NGO civil society sector is pretty deep. Indeed, when we see the protests on the streets against, or particularly last year, against the foreign influence law, if you track the numbers that were on the streets and then track the number of people employed by Western-friendly NGOs in Tbilisi, you get quite a similar number. So I'm not saying that there isn't, sort of opposition to Georgian Dream, on the ground in Georgia, but there's a very, very strong sector that's allied to the West. In terms of what's going to happen in the short term, it is very likely that Georgian Dream will be the largest party. whether or not, I mean, they're coming out with some pretty, should we say, firm statements that if they get, I can't remember the term they use, like essentially a supermajority, if they get sort of enough of the votes in Parliament, that they will actually ban the UNM, the Saakashvili party. It's unlikely that they'll get that far, but what's almost certain to happen is that they will be the largest party, and there will be protests on the street. And whether the West can instigate a second kind of revolution in Georgia, I don't know. I suspect they won't be able to, actually, but as you know, we'll see. That's the big thing that's to watch out for in the area in the immediate future. As in terms of the longer future, I agree. I mean, if Georgia can keep Western forces at bay for this period and get through to when the Ukraine situation will be clearer, then I do expect a greater Russian alignment in the future in Georgia. There's Naré talks a little bit about the major pipeline that goes through the Baku-Tbilisi and Ceyhan pipeline. In reality, the Georgian government got a terrible deal out of that. They have no ownership of the pipeline. The transit fees that they get out of it are like a tenth of the value of wine exports to Russia. I mean, it's key for the West, but actually, it's not that key for Georgia. It's only key for Georgia, to the extent to which it's of strategic interest to the West, as it were. The other sort of really interesting developments in Georgia of late is that Ivanishvili has come out. Sorry, he's the Russian, or he's the Georgian billionaire who made his money in Russia, who's basically the power behind Georgian Dream, has come out quite publicly and basically said that Georgia is apologizes for its actions against South Ossetia and Abkhazia in 2008, and that they're looking towards some element of a more federated structure, which is code for we basically recognize effective independence of Abkhazia, maybe South Ossetia too. As I said earlier, essentially Abkhazia will be de facto and independent from now on. We've seen that with the building of the Russian naval base. It's key interest to Russia. South Ossetia, I have more questions about, and I would just note in this that the population of the South Ossetian population is less than half of that of Artsakh. So, if there was a deal to be done that could show face, it's not even off the cards. I think in terms of what Georgia would have to show for a realignment to Russia.
And what do you make of what will? Thank you. That's very interesting and quite a bit that I didn't know. What would you make of the future prospects of Armenia in the near and medium term before we move to Naré?
I'm quite clear in terms of what Armenia should do, which is to majorly ally with Iran. I think the other side that I'm going to flip back slightly to Georgia here is that the major factor that I think Russia is looking at is, as we almost started this stream with, it's the complex linguistic and population and religious mix of the North Caucasus. Russia, as we looked at earlier, Russia's not going to be invaded by NATO through the Caucasus. Its primary defensive aspect at the moment and in the future is to keep those almost entirely Muslim populations of the North Caucasus, whether they be the sort of Caucasian linguistic speaking of the Turkish languages, calm. We all know the Chechen War. We all know, for example, that the sort of nominal leader of the anti-Gaddarov Chechens, who call themselves Ishkerians, is based in London under police protection and has been rolled out in early days of the Ukraine war to support Ukraine forces. There are strong suspicions that going back in time that, and again, as they are wont to do, that Chechen uprisings in the early days were aided by the CIA. Russia will want
people
to keep
like
those
Shamil Bashayev and the rest of them in the 90s.
Yeah. So as I look at it, I think Russia's prime interest at the moment and will be in Georgia, and Armenia is secondary to that. And Armenia needs to look to Iran to, Iran clearly states all the time that it does not, it will not brook border changes in the South Caucasus. I think I would just say that Armenia needs to listen to that, and I'm sure Naré would agree with that.
Yeah, of course. I think that it has become clear. I mean, from the times of independence already, the Middle East has been calling Armenia, and perhaps now after this debacle with a Western regime, it is time to actually heed this call and just have stronger ties with Iran. Also, given that it would be perhaps like the only other country benefiting from an Armenian Artsakh. And of course, like in the international court, there is this like acknowledged right of return, etc., etc. And, the right to self-determination of Artsakh was also another thing like that was in Minsk, the Minsk group consisting of Russia, France, and America. They acknowledged this right and championed this right to self-determination. And this was in the Kazan Principle, Madrid Principles, and I think eventually Armenia should insist on the Artsakhs' right to return. They have been living there since, I don't know, perhaps like BC times. They're like an indigenous population. They have never been under direct control of Baku. This is like an unprecedented thing to happen. This territory has never been under Azeri control, especially like given what Baku is doing internally and externally, this fascist like consolidation of power. Like we didn't really address much Azerbaijan about how, I guess, like if as far as the democratic Western ratings are concerned, it just gets 0 all the time consistently. There is no opposition, no possibility of opposition, really ghastly like human rights. Like they arrest people when they just, return to Azerbaijan for a wedding, even if these people are, 25-year-old activists that are against war with Armenia. So it's clear that, Armenians are not going to, and it's like hatred for Armenians is everywhere in Baku, in educational system, from the lowest echelon to the highest. And Aliyev consistently claims all of Armenia as like Western Azerbaijan, and it claims parts of Iran as Southern Azerbaijan. So this makes the configuration is very clear that Armenia needs to get into an alliance with Iran, no matter what the West wants or doesn't want. And I guess as my regained nationalist sentiments, that's what is nationalist sentiment. It's like when you just follow your national interest. Anyway, so looking back, it is very clear that even though they're saying, peace is close now, it's so clear to me that we had regional peace when Armenia had control over Artsakh. And I think in the future, after we return like a patriotic, more or less Armenian interest, state interest aligned government, this should be a part of the doctrine, is that regional peace is impossible without an Armenian Artsakh. And we clearly saw that as soon as Armenia got a quote-unquote peace-loving, demilitarized leader. Every year we have war. Every year we have these martyrs. Every year we have this, humiliation of our country. and all our best generals are jailed on trumped-up charges. Anybody who could make a difference. The shipments of weapons have stopped. And as someone like me, someone who has protested back in 2018, I know it is difficult to believe that now, but I was young and foolish, and I had just returned from America, where I was studying, and I was also out on the streets demanding that Sargsyan leave power, which was the third president of Armenia. But what it showed me is that having this type of Western aspirations, as in, accountability, transparency, all these nice things as they're presented to you, demanding that leads to your national interest being completely subjugated to Azerbaijan and having war every year. And, and your people, 150,000 of them, losing their homes. And, you just, every year you're going to protest and protest and protest. And you have more and more police against you. So apparently this is what it means when you align with extra-regional forces that don't really have anything to offer to you except subjugation.
Well, yeah, sadly, that seems to be the case. Imperial powers nearby. I certainly understand why Armenia would have no interest in reaching accommodations with the Turks. It's shocking to me to hear you say that they're talking about teaching Turkish in Armenian schools. But at least the Turks know something about Armenians and have a long history with them. Georgians, likewise. Azeris, likewise. But the Russians and the Iranians, as you say, perhaps more so the Iranians these days, who have, they're, as I understand it, there are many Armenians in Iran. It would seem that Iran could be a path forward for them. As a matter of fact, perhaps you can clarify this, Naré. It's just a totally random question, but I've always wondered about it. There are many names that I hear that are Iranian names that have the yan suffix, but someone told me once that not all of those yan suffix names in Iran are actually of Armenian descent. Is that correct?
Yeah, this is correct. A lot of those are just Iranian because, last names in Iran and in Armenia, most of them don't really have this type of long history. It was, I think, somewhere in the 19th century when it became sort of mandatory to have a last name, to just have it on the documents. So yeah, the origins of Iranian last names are also it's vague. Yeah, some of them have yan endings. But, as you probably know, the Armenians that had been displaced from their, current habitat, a lot of them, they lived right along the border, a little bit further. You see Tabriz, Khoy, Salmas. This was all considered a part of the Barskahayk, which is the Persian Armenia. Then, of course, with this Russian Empire war, they all relocated to escape this Qajar rule. With Qajar were again, Turkish tribes. They relocated to Armenia, and my ancestors too. Originally, half of them were from these areas. This northwestern, what is now northwestern Iran, and yeah, we go back and forth quite frequently. I have friends in Khoy, I have in Tabriz and in Tehran. So I think it's just as soon as this illusion of Iran as this big, scary place where they throw sticks at you for random things that the Western media tells us it is, as soon as this illusion goes away, then Armenians can find out that Iran is perhaps something similar to just a bigger Armenia, a more multi-ethnic Armenia. There are many similarities.
Yeah, and okay, here's one last, because I don't often have the opportunity to ask this question. Do you think that describing Armenia as ancient cousins of the Persians who converted to Christianity is a fair description?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think a lot of the moves that we made as Christianity, the alphabet, they were dictated by this, need to mark our identity and to have just this different code, different way of being. And if you look at way back, it's clear that it's like two very, very ancient civilizations. Armenia, I guess, for the longest time, it served as this the in-betweener, I guess, this bit of like a buffer. It was like Persia, Byzantines, Persia, Rome, and then even after the Soviets sort of claimed, and as a result of like Lenin's belief in the nation's right to self-determination and everything, and the Armenian Bolsheviks played their part as well. Then after Armenia even started existing in this form, it still served as this like buffer area because nothing much was going on there. Nobody had any like inkling of movement here. It was just Soviet Union, so it still served this mission. And Armenia, in contrast to Azerbaijan, is distinct enough, as we said, language, culture, all these aspects, and also the big Western part that has also had a big part in like shaping the Armenian identity in all its different ways. It's distinct enough that collaborating with Iran, it shouldn't really like fear these absorption, something that Azerbaijan probably feels very deeply. And this is why they have made this pragmatic decision to align with Turkey and just completely adopt this Turkish identity, is because actually the Azeris of Baku Republic, Azerbaijan, are not very different. I mean, now I guess they've obtained political identity, but in their very essence, they are not very different from the Azeris in Tabriz. So it's we see a whole new political identity developing in Azerbaijan, and we'll see how it unfolds as we'll see if this project will succeed in like inventing an anti-Iranian, anti-Armenian identity, but one that also maybe doesn't really want to be completely absorbed into Turkey.
Yeah, one thing that I would just throw in as a last bit is I could certainly see how Iran acting in some respect as a savior of a Christian nation or a guarantor of its security. Certainly one of the oldest Christian nation outside the immediate Middle East. Well, I guess the oldest Christian nation, I should just say. That could be a coup of sorts for Iran in terms of international perceptions and how it could position itself. And I imagine perhaps there are sharp pencil people in Iran giving thought to the value of that. Although it does raise questions about, how it will be perceived in the broader Muslim world. But of course, Iran has its willingness to go its own way, being a 12er Shiite nation, which already causes some static, less so these days with the Sunni majority. But yeah, that's one last thing that I just wanted to, note that there.
Yeah, I think PR-wise, it's going to be a big win on the part of Iran. But the interesting thing is that the protest movements that we have now, and it's like the biggest since 2018, it's the biggest gatherings. They're led by effectively the Armenian church, even though it's not going full in, but it's acting via. It's the Tavush Diocese Archbishop Bagrat Galstanyan. And, Armenian Church is also it has such a rich institutional memory, and it has acted as a replacement of the state when Armenia didn't really have that in its, long history. So it will be interesting to observe how, if this movement succeeds in taking power, how the Iranian sort of Shia Muslims will interact with the Armenian church that will effectively be in power in some way. And like the Armenian church is also the part of the elite that was not completely destroyed by Pashinyan. We had a lot of the army preemptively, discarded, fired, but they tried to make moves against the church, but they did not really succeed. So it has been more or less like kept intact since 2018. And same can be said about Georgia, actually. Like the church maintained a lot of its like real estate, a lot of its power, even though the country was going through all these, color revolutions. So in terms of the Shia and Christian division, there's, I think, the Sheikh Imran Hussein, who was saying that the real battle is not really between, Christians and Muslims. It's not about the civilizations, but it's about, true Christianity versus bogus Christianity, and true Islam versus bogus Islam. So I don't. It depends on if the players here will be able to understand and find this common ground in, the Shia eschatology, as you know, is very aligned with the Armenian Apostolic Church in terms that, they expect the coming of their prophet Mahdi to be with Jesus, and so it's already, we have so much to work with if we're gonna make this happen.
Very interesting. Yes. Well, yeah, very interesting indeed. I think this ended on an excellent note in terms of food for further thought. And I'm also very, very happy to have had both of you as guests. It's fascinating to listen to this. This isn't an area I've focused on. I lived in Turkey, and I've paid quite a bit of attention to the Caucasus and gone fairly deep in studying the Circassians. But Armenia, I just didn't know that much about. So this has been very helpful. I hope it's been helpful for all of our listeners as well. I'm sure they are grateful as I am for the opportunity to speak to both of you. Before I wrap up, I do want to ask if either of you have anything to promote, any channels or content or upcoming projects or anything like that. If that is the case, please let my audience know now. Let's start with Matt. And any final thoughts that you think were missed that you didn't have a chance to share.
A very small point on that last issue that we were talking about. The Christian community of Iran are, very very secure and safe and protected. But also we have to look at, who are the Christian communities of the Middle East. They're in places, like Lebanon and Palestine that, are potentially more aligned with pro-Iranian interests, not the other side, if we can put it like that. In terms of promoting things, well, I mean, follow me on Twitter. I'm at FragmentSure on Twitter, and check out my Substack, which is called Dogmatic Slumbers, and I believe Semigog, you've been good enough to link those in the notes. So yeah, it's been a great chat. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure, definitely. And yeah, I did not put the link to your Twitter, but I will add it in the description below. And if there are any links you would like included, Naré, I have no idea. I'm not quite sure what you're working on or what you want to share. But if there are any like that, let me know, and I will add them immediately after the stream. But Naré, please go ahead.
Yeah, on what Matt said about Christianity in the Middle East, it is really like a very good point, because we have the Armenian quarter of Jerusalem that is right now also under attack. We have like 4,000 ancient manuscripts. So this is a very interesting thing. Like that is under attack. And then in Lebanon, we have our biggest sort of nationalist, like the go-to nationalist party, the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, has like a working military alliance with Hezbollah. And there's like also an Armenian quarter there in Burchamut. There's a whole, city, Anjar, that is made like recreated exactly in the model of all these like villages. that were, genocided in Turkey, and the French saved them and gave them space there. So there's like a lot to work with if we're going to make this a thing. But like protecting Christians in the Middle East is, I guess, like a mission that somebody must take on. At least for Armenians, for whom Christianity, I guess, still has like a real political meaning, as opposed to in some other places where it has lost it. Yeah, in terms of what I can promote, I guess people can follow me on Twitter too. It's this Soveraganton, what I have here. And yeah, that's about it. Thank you so much. This was a very interesting conversation.
Yes, and again, thank you both very much, and thanks to all of our listeners. I hope you will come back and check out upcoming streams. I hope both of you might be willing in the future to come back as the situation in Armenia changes and perhaps revisit it. And then I do, on the subject of Christianity in the Middle East, feel that it is an appropriate time to promote a stream that I will have on the 4th of October with Apostolic Majesty, who has an excellent history channel. He's been doing a series called the Agony of Christians in the Middle East, and we're going to be revisiting that fairly soon, October 4th, on Apostolic Majesty's channel, which you can find on YouTube. If that subject is of interest to you, I recommend that you not miss this upcoming stream. And Naré and Matt, you've both given me quite a bit of food for thought. I'm going to go and dig into the situation of Christians in Iran in some depth before this stream, because so much consideration is generally given to the Levantine coast. But okay, ladies and gents, guests and listeners, one and all, thank you very, very much for your time. And until next time, I'm Semiagog, and I am out.